Culture shock I am going through right now in realizing that corporate culture and capitalism is different outside of the United States.
So why do corporations in the United States treat their workers so poorly?
It is my second day at my new job where I am the only US employee. Everybody else at my company lives and works in Iceland. I thought the weirdest thing to navigate would likely be the time difference, which is about 7 hours. Instead, I'm realizing that companies outside of the United States actually care about you as a full person. An example is that my manager told me that on Mondays they have their weekly sync and they kick it off with everybody talking about their feelings. Me, as an American, I was seeing the vacant expression that I made when the subject of a feelings circle happened. My boss explained why. The idea behind it is that we spend so much of our day at work that it is only natural and normal that our lives outside of work bleed into it. So in knowing where we are all coming from, we know how to communicate better, we know how to approach each other better, and we in turn work together better. And I'm not sure if this would work in a lot of organizations where there's a lot of trust required to express your feelings and knowing that they're not going to be used against you. It's not going to be seen as less productive. It's just like you existing. Needless to say, my mind was blown.
This TikTok by Serena Marie points out her experience working for an Icelandic company and realizing that corporate environments tend to be completely different in other countries. And this is one of those areas where the United States' unique and particularly evil history actually still has major impact on the way businesses go about doing business to this very day. And believe it or not, it all goes back to slavery. You see, slavery was really the defining feature of the United States economy for the first half of the country existing. And obviously slavery still exists today in our prison system, but slavery actually had a much larger cultural impact than most people realize, because the very idea of managers and managerialism actually is something that was born out of slavery in the United States. It has its historical origin in slave overseers. Because they did not fundamentally view the people they had enslaved as human beings, they treated them quite literally like cogs in a machine and systematically developed mechanisms to micromanage them and to squeeze out as much production as they possibly could out of them. They actually had trade journals where they would share ideas and talk very publicly about the way that they would develop incentive structures and systems to ensure that they could force enslaved people to push out as much productivity as they possibly could. And that really is the origin of management as a field of study. Now, in order to understand how the next phase in history came about, we need to understand something about pre-industrial capitalism. You see, in pre-industrial capitalism, most people were actually paid per item that they produced physically, or they were salaried. And the assumption was that if you hired somebody outside of purchasing a good or service one time that they produced, or on a per unit basis if you had an ongoing relationship, that you would pay somebody's salary with the understanding that you were responsible for their family and their livelihood. That if you were going to take most of somebody's waking hours away from them, that you would pay them back by being responsible as an employer for their entire well-being. And in comes the idea of hourly wages. Hourly wages actually have their historical origin in the renting of slaves. Now, the first instances of that were in the Roman Empire, but even then it was deeply unpopular, and it was still unpopular until the rise of industrial capitalism in the United States, where after slavery was kind of abolished in the United States, all of a sudden the idea of renting slaves became all of the rage. But who did these people rent slaves from? Well, obviously they rented slaves from the prisons that were set up to wrongfully jail the recently freed Black Americans who were previously enslaved. And believe it or not, industrialists in northern states actually saw this as a huge opportunity to completely shift their factory workers from a per unit pay structure to an hourly wage pay structure. But the whole idea of the hourly wage was the idea that you were renting a person and that you wouldn't be responsible for their livelihood. You were simply renting a portion of their time, and you weren't hiring them as a salaried employee where it would be expected that you take care of them. No, With the hourly wages, they claimed that people were free to do whatever they wanted with their own time outside of working hours. But as long as you're working within the workplace, well, the managers get to determine what you're doing with your time. And that's where the whole idea of if you have time to lean, you have time to clean really came from. Because before that, if you were a salaried worker and there wasn't any work to do, people would just let you take the day off because obviously they needed you on staff, but maybe they just didn't need you on that particular day or for as much time. And if you were being paid on a per unit basis, well, if there wasn't any work to do, you weren't in the factory. But with hourly wages, everything was completely turned on its head. And it stemmed from, at its root, a belief that they were still renting people, that they still had authority over you as a person, not just the individual things you produce, but you as an entire person. And that mentality has never gone away.